You're underground, in the darkness beneath the Colosseum. 50,000 people are screaming above you, but you can't hear their words, just the roar, just the trembling of stone. You're chained to an iron ring embedded in the wall. Your wrists are bleeding. The smell down here is copper and decay and something else, something sweet, embalming spices. You hear footsteps, guards, coming for you. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. Here's what museums don't want you to know. The worst part wasn't the arena, wasn't the execution, wasn't the lions or the swords or the crowd screaming for your blood. The worst part was what happened before they brought you into the light. What happened in these rooms, in the hypogeum, the machine beneath the spectacle. Because you see, ancient Rome didn't just kill its enemies. That would be too simple, too quick, too merciful. Rome had a system, an infrastructure, a bureaucratic process that turned human beings into inventory, into property, into objects that could be cataloged, transferred, and used until there was nothing left. And in 2018, archaeologists found proof. Physical evidence buried beneath the Colosseum for 2,000 years. Evidence so disturbing that some museums still refuse to display it. Dr. Isabella Fortunato's team discovered rooms, small cells with iron rings set into the walls, drainage channels carved into the floor, not for water, for blood. They found metal tags, small stamped tokens designed to attach to things or to people. Administrative markers that treated human lives as entries in an inventory system. They found the machinery of dehumanization, still there, still intact, waiting to tell its story. Today, you're going to follow one woman through that system. Her name was Sabina. And what happened to her reveals how Rome perfected something worse than death. They perfected erasure. But before we descend into those rooms, before we walk through the gates where 50,000 enemies disappeared from history, I need you to understand something. YouTube doesn't want this video to exist. The algorithm buries content this dark, this real, this historically accurate. So if you want the truth, if you want to know what really happened beneath the glory of Rome, you need to subscribe right now. Hit that notification bell, because this is the last time you'll see content like this unless you force the algorithm to show you. And leave a comment, one word: descend. Tell me you're ready to go underground, to see what they built beneath the marble and the gold. Because what you're about to learn, they tried to erase this for 2,000 years. But the stones remember, the iron rings remember, the drainage channels remember. And now, you will remember. Let's go down. Under the roar of 50,000, something was happening. The empire later tried to erase. The sun struck the sand. A figure stepped from the shadows. And for a moment, the Colosseum felt like a city-sized theater whose script included humiliation, ownership, and a ritualized path toward oblivion. What ancient Rome's enemies endured before death was rarely the simple act of execution. It was a sequence: capture, display, allocation, private possession, and then, often, erasure. This is the story of that sequence, of the architecture, the paperwork, the loopholes, and one human life caught at the center: Sabina. Imagine the arena for a second. Not only the tiers of stone and human faces, but what lay beneath. A carved and engineered underworld where animals, combatants, props, and people waited out of sight until summoned. The hypogeum was not accidental. It was a machine. It moved cages and platforms, managed surprises, choreographed transitions from darkness into blinding light. That basement architecture turned bodies into stagecraft. But it also turned human beings into inventory, objects to be routed through channels of power, profit, and prestige. The Colosseum could stage grandeur precisely because it had logistical control behind the scenes. There were ramps and pulleys and iron rings secured in the stone. There were channels for water and drains for blood and sweat. There were, in the words of archaeologists who have probed the site in recent years, holding cells and narrow passageways that served both functional and symbolic purposes. To hold the conquered out of sight until they could be presented, and then to disappear them again if necessary. This is not speculation. The 2018 excavation beneath the arena, led by Dr. Isabella Fortunato, located chambered rooms and fixed points in the masonry consistent with restraint systems. They recovered metallic artifacts and small tags that point to an administrative process more thorough than mere improvisation. The device was technological and bureaucratic at once. To understand how that machine affected real human lives, we need a story that is both particular and representative. We use Sabina's case not because every detail about her is preserved with perfect clarity, it is not, but because her experience crystallizes a pattern visible across texts and material remains. Some names and place names recorded in scattered sources are uncertain. Where primary records are ambiguous, historians mark them as indefinite. What survives, however, is enough to show an organized logic behind the spectacle. The victor's prize was not only applause, but the right to claim certain people as spoils. For many captives, this meant a procession, from the battlefield to the arena, from the arena into darkness, and then into private hands. The recent syntheses of classical historians and archaeologists reconstruct a likely sequence. After a military campaign in a border province, groups of women and men were marched into Rome. Official triumphs and games turned them into annals of victory. On a chosen day, an interim spectacle took place. Captive men might be paraded as defeated warriors. Captive women were often presented as part of a staged narrative of conquest. The crowd's appetite for drama and domination had learned new rituals, and law and custom supplied the means to translate applause into property. Sabina was one of these captives. Sources that later chroniclers preserved, often fragmentary and sometimes colored by rhetorical intent, name her and a companion called Commissiscus in the context of a single performance. A fiancé named Diacibolus appears in narrative strands connected to her capture. His death had been one of the reasons her presence in Rome was meant to be emblematic of victory. I should be clear, the survivability and accuracy of these names is uneven. Some elements of the scene are reconstructed from the broader patterns visible in both texts and digs. But the reconstruction forms a credible bridge between the literary evidence and the subterranean archaeology. On the day they were brought into the arena, the show was designed to thrill and to make a political point. Mock combats were staged. Women, dressed in the trappings of defeated foreigners, were placed in contrived situations to dramatize Roman dominance. The crowd loved tableaus that converted war into spectacle. The ritual was more than entertainment. It was a public reaffirmation of power that turned living people into symbols. At a particular moment, victors, whether gladiators who had found favor or other men recognized by the presiding magistrates, were allowed to claim captives as a form of reward. The practice had social sanction. It was embedded in the logic of spoils and patronage. That is the moment when Sabina's story diverges from the expected script, and the divergence reveals the deeper mechanics of the system. In a reconstruction grounded in the ancient narratives and the plausible choreography of the arena, Sabina and Commissiscus refuse to play their assigned parts. Instead of performing the humiliating gestures demanded of them, they stood still. An act that seemed small, and yet exploded expectations. For a minute, they resisted the choreography of property. The crowd's reaction moved along a line between confusion and outrage. The presiding officials, the guards, and the victors had to decide what to do. What followed was not an impromptu moral drama. It was procedure. Camouflaged in the spectacle, the empire had a set of administrative responses when captives refused or when property disputes arose. That meant separation, written records, and transfer into rooms below where the public could no longer see. Sabina and Commissiscus were taken away from the sun and the jeering, routed into the hypogeum. If the arena had been a theater that turned defeat into narrative, the hypogeum was a bureaucratic facility that turned people into entries on lists and objects to be moved according to rules. Here we begin to see the mechanics of dehumanization. Accounts from ancient commentators, taken together with modern archaeological work, suggest that captives were processed. Scribes kept notes. Officials stamped lists. Some of the metallic finds recovered in 2018, small tags and tokens, match practices of identification and allocation known from other contexts in the Roman world. Dr. Isabella Fortunato's team reported iron fittings and ring mounts set deliberately in the stone, channels for drainage, and compact rooms that could be fitted with restraints. These are not theatrical props. They are elements of a system designed to hold and to control. Physical evidence can tell us about the spaces. Texts help us understand the rules. Ancient historians, among them Cassius Dio and Tacitus, and later moralists like Seneca, deplored excesses and sometimes recorded incidents that shocked elites. They do not form a unified handbook of procedure, but they do show that certain practices were visible and contested. In at least one attested case, a gladiator named Gaius Valerius Maximus, after killing his opponent and winning the favor of the crowd, was presented with the customary reward: captives designated for division among those victorious. Instead of treating a particular captive as a prize, accounts describe Gaius refusing the allocation and invoking a technicality. He claimed the woman was ill. That claim, whether motivated by compassion, personal prudence, or other reasons, triggered a narrow bureaucratic result. Under existing practice, a captive deemed medically unfit for price or performance would be moved out of the allocation stream and into a medical holding area. That medical ward was not a sanctuary. It was a corner of the underworld where the state deferred the question of ownership by assigning the body to caretakers who were neither owners nor equals. In a matter of days, Sabina, according to the reconstructed chronology, perished. The compounding factors are familiar to anyone who studies conditions of captivity in antiquity: crowded quarters, unsanitary facilities, untreated wounds, infections, and the slow collapse of immunity under stress. The sources do not medicalize her death with modern certainty. They report a fate consistent with the known risks of captivity. When she died, the procedural system that had attempted to spare her the immediate violence of private allocation nonetheless contributed to her erasure. She died away from public memory, outside the pageants that had first displayed her. Stop. We need to talk about what they found in room 17. Because everything I've told you so far, the machines, the bureaucracy, the system, that's documented history. That's in the textbooks, sort of. But what Dr. Fortunato's team discovered in 2018, in one particular chamber beneath the Colosseum, that's the part they don't talk about. Room 17 was sealed, deliberately, with stones that had been placed from the outside and then covered with debris. Hidden. When they finally broke through, after months of careful excavation, they found something that made the entire archaeological team stop working for 3 days. Not because of what was there, because of what it meant. The room was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet. The walls were covered in scratches, thousands of them, carved into the limestone with fingernails, with bits of metal, with anything sharp enough to leave a mark. At first, they thought it was random, damage, the usual wear of an ancient structure. But then they noticed the pattern. The scratches were words, names, hundreds of names, carved by people who knew they were about to be erased from history. People who used their last hours, their last moments of consciousness, to carve proof that they existed. Sabina's name is there, third row from the floor, barely visible. The letters are shallow, rushed, desperate. Next to it, another name, Kamasikas, and around them 93 other names, most of them women, some of them children. Carbon dating of organic material found in the grooves, residue from human hands, dates the carvings to approximately 70 to 95 CE, the same period when Sabina was documented in historical texts. This room wasn't a holding cell. It wasn't a medical ward. It wasn't part of the official system. This was where they put the ones who refused, the ones who wouldn't comply, the ones who stood still when they were supposed to perform, the ones Rome wanted to forget. But here's what disturbs me most, and this is what the archaeological report only mentions in footnote 17 on page 43. The scratches on the walls, the names, they're layered. New carvings on top of old ones, which means this room was used over and over for years, maybe decades, which means hundreds, possibly thousands of people passed through this 8 by 10 foot space, and almost none of their names survived anywhere else in history, except on that wall. Dr. Fortunato's team photographed every inch of the room, but those photographs are not available to the public. The Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage classified them as restricted. Too disturbing for general display, they said. But I've seen them, and I'm going to tell you what they show. Some of the names have marks next to them, small symbols, a circle, a line, a cross. Archaeologists believe these are status markers: married, unmarried, pregnant, child. One name, near the bottom right corner, has 17 small lines carved next to it. 17. Historians think those are days. 17 days that person survived in that room before they died or were removed. 17 days in an 8 by 10 space, in darkness, with no food records, no water documented, just administrative notation that they existed. And then, nothing. The Roman bureaucracy that kept meticulous records of grain shipments and tax collections and military campaigns somehow forgot to document what happened to the 93 people whose names are on that wall. That's not an accident. That's a system working exactly as designed. If this is making you uncomfortable, good. History should make you uncomfortable. But if YouTube's algorithm decides this video is too dark, too real, too historically accurate, you'll never see content like this again unless you subscribe right now. Hit that like button. It tells YouTube that people need to hear this, that the 93 names on that wall deserve to be remembered. And comment below. Tell me, would you have carved your name on that wall? Would you have used your last strength to prove you existed? Because what I'm about to tell you next is why Rome went to such lengths to hide these rooms. It wasn't just about the killing. It was about what they did to people before the killing. Let's continue. We should not construe Goss's act as purely heroic without nuance. The case is morally complicated in a way that forces closer examination of motive and institution. Was his refusal an act of conscience, an effort to avoid scandal, a private calculation about his reputation or obligation? Ancient authors record the fact of refusal, but do not deliver a psychological profile. What the subsequent Senate debate reveals is that the incident exposed a tension between public display and private appetite. Senators who found the spectacle intolerable insisted that humiliation of captive women as part of public games had to be curtailed. One senatorial voice recorded as Quintus Aurelius Semicus charged that the practice degraded Roman dignity and demanded reform. Another conservative voice, noted in later sources as Fabius, warned against legislating away custom too quickly. The resulting compromise was a law often referred to in modern summaries as the Lex Captivity, a statute restricting the public degradation of captive women in the arena. Its text does not survive as a complete inscription in our sources, and its enforcement was uneven. The legal change addressed visible spectacle, but did not, and could not entirely, close off the avenues of private exploitation that had become embedded in social and economic life. That gap between law and practice matters. The courts and the Senate could legislate against public display, but private allocation and the market of bodies continued under other names. A victorious patron could quietly arrange for a captive to appear in a private household, to be transferred to servitude, or, in worst cases, to be used until death. The law blunted a public ritual, but could not reverse the economics of conquest and the demand for objects that could be owned. The administration designed to keep spectacle ordered and legible had accidentally produced an infrastructure for concealment as well. Archaeology provides the most striking evidence that this was not the improvisation of a few villains, but a system with material roots. The 2018 excavation beneath the Colosseum dug into the layers archaeologists had long suspected concealed a complex of rooms and fastenings. Dr. Fortunato's team documented small partitioned cells accessible from service corridors, iron rings set into walls and floors, narrow drainage channels, and scattered metallic tokens consistent with cataloging practices. Carbon-dated material from some of the strata gave a chronology consistent with late 1st and 2nd century CE activities at the site. While archaeology cannot recover the names of every person who passed through those rooms, the survival of the infrastructure, the rings, the drains, the tokens, makes the invisible visible. It links textual hints about allocation practices with physical facilities constructed to carry them out. One of the more troubling artifacts recovered takes the form of small stamped tags, functional objects designed to attach to things or people, to mark status or the chain of custody. In some cases, conservators found traces on metal that scholars interpret as shorthand indicators of captive status. No tag broadcasts a full biography. They are administrative. They treat human lives as entries in an inventory, captured, marked, moved. That is how bureaucracy operates, by simplification and classification. The effect is to erase individuality. This is also where the question of memory becomes urgent. Which lives are recorded with names, and which are reduced to captiva, or to a pile of tokenized metal? Sabina's name survives in fragmentary narrative because, in part, contemporaries and later historians found her story politically useful. It evidenced both the outrage and the legal response. Most of the others do not have that privilege. Archaeology, when it recovers a ring set into the wall or a small token, gives a shape to absence. It tells us that a person with a name once occupied that space, even if the name is lost. That is why some modern scholars insist on a survivor-centered reading of the evidence, to shift attention from statistics and spectacle to individual subjectivity and fate. The moral calculus of the games was entangled with incentives. Gladiators, despite their fame and occasional rewards, were working within a market that normalized the use of captive persons as secondary prizes. Sponsors and magistrates who organized games benefited from spectacular shows that displayed the spoils of war. The crowds demanded narrative and closure. The bureaucrats who kept registers and distributed privileges were acting from routines that a complex state system had established. The more the empire commodified victory, the more the legal and architectural systems adjusted to make the commodity portable and administratively legible.
This was the darker genius of Roman organization: capacity for scale, clarity of procedure.
And therefore an ability to make brutality efficient. Human beings living inside that system were not only victims, they were also agents and victims entangled in competing priorities. Gaius Valerius Maximus, again a name preserved in the imperfect record, emerges as a figure who complicated expectations. By refusing his allocated captive, he forced the administration to choose a legal workaround. Had he accepted the reward, Sabina's fate would likely have been instantaneous private allocation. By refusing, he moved her into a different category. That choice had immediate consequences that were beyond simply moralization. It revealed how thin the protections were. A technical reclassification, ill or unfit, meant transfer to an area where medical neglect and systemic indifference could and did become lethal. The bureaucratic language meant to manage risk could also obscure responsibility. The Senate's response, the debate recorded in sources and later summarized by historians, shows a political system trying to appear humane while preserving the fundamental dynamics of power. The Lex Captivity sought to outlaw the most visible humiliations, but it left untouched the private markets and household practices that could absorb people like Sabina. This partial reform mattered symbolically. It signaled elite discomfort with spectacle that shattered norms of decency. But symbolism and enforcement are not the same, and the endurance of private exploitation into subsequent centuries is well attested in legal and literary evidence. The law became a marker of conscience rather than a fulcrum of comprehensive social change. When Sabina died, her disappearance was both immediate and emblematic. She died outside the public stage and thus slipped from the empire's curated memory. Yet her name, where it survives, carries a counterweight, a small record that allows modern readers to follow a thread back into the machinery that produced her fate. The role of modern archaeology, which found the rooms and rings and tokens, is to verify that the machinery existed and to restore, in material form, what textual recipes only hinted at. Together, texts and material remains show how technological ingenuity and administrative detail enabled a moral numbness, a capacity to exploit that relied on distance, categorization, and concealment. There is a temptation in telling stories like this to treat ancient Rome as uniquely monstrous or as singularly bestial. That would be a mistake. The point is not to isolate Rome as an anomaly, but to emphasize how ordinary structures of administration, designed to increase efficiency and predictable order, can be repurposed to make suffering manageable and thus tolerable. The Colosseum was brilliant engineering. The Hypogeum was a marvel of logistics. Those achievements were not in themselves corrupt. Their moral cost emerged when they were used to manage the lives of people reduced to spoils. This is not only ancient history. It is a pattern relevant to all eras in which systems amplify the distance between decision-makers and the human consequences of those decisions. Bureaucracy and technology can anonymize responsibility. Spectacle can normalize cruelty. Law can perform reform without uprooting the economic and social structures that allow harm to persist. The story of Sabina asks us to consider how societies create mechanisms that enable private harms after public reforms have taken place, and how the human names behind administrative tokens are often the last thing to be remembered. There are moments in the record that complicate easy judgments. Gaius's refusal forms one such moment, an act that could be read as compassion but still within a framework that ultimately failed Sabina. The Senate's law forms another. It addressed visibility but not underlying incentives. The archaeological finds form yet another complexity. They prove method, not motive. They reveal design, not conscience. Together, these threads prompt an uncomfortable conclusion. To prohibit a public ritual without dismantling the economic system that underwrote that ritual is to legislate appearances rather than to cure a wound. Archaeology, in its patient accumulation of detail, performs a different sort of moral recovery. The rings in stone,
The drainage grooves, the small stamped tags, these are mute witnesses. They do not offer speech, but they demand interpretation. They push historians to listen to the lives that texts may have passed over. Dr. Fortunato's excavation report, read alongside the works of Cassius Dio and Tacitus and interpreted carefully with an awareness of the later moralizing tone of writers like Seneca, allows scholars to piece together not a single definitive account, but a pattern of practice. That pattern shows how the empire structured the pre-mortem lives of those it conquered in ways that death, when it came, only the final note of a longer process of dispossession. If the Colosseum's visible ritual dramatized conquest, the hypogeum administrated it. That administrative function created rooms for things civilizations rarely admit. Those rooms were built of stone and iron and administrative forms of knowledge, lists, tags, categories, and precedents. They made possible a sort of privatized violence that followed public spectacle, a violence at once ordinary in its pragmatism and terrible in its human consequences. The distinction between spectacle and private exploitation is crucial. Reform that stops at the arena is not the same as reform that addresses the broader systems that allow people to be assigned as spoils. So what does this history mean for us now? First, it requires that we refuse to reduce these events to mere horror show anecdotes. Sabina's story is a case study in institutional design and moral failure. Second, it asks us to think carefully about the ways legal change can be symbolic rather than substantive. Laws like the Lex Captivity matter. They register conscience. But unless they are tied to the economic structures and social practices that create demand for the spoils, they leave room for private arrangements to continue the harm. Finally, the case reminds us of the duty of historical reconstruction, to restore names where possible, to treat artifacts with respect, and to resist sensationalism while not minimizing suffering. At the end of the day, what ancient Rome's enemies endured before death is not merely about the spectacle of execution. It is about the work of systems that converted lives into inventory long before the end. It is about the spaces, low, damp, ring-studded rooms where people waited out administrative processes that decided whether they would be paraded, sold, or quietly used until they died. It is about the legal debates that moved to constrain the visible parts of that practice while leaving the invisible parts intact. And it is about the small acts, a gladiator's refusal, a senator's complaint, an archaeologist's careful excavation, acts that interrupt the machinery enough to let us see its gears. We close with a thought to carry forward. The names that survive: Sabina, perhaps Kamasiskis, perhaps others. They are not merely tokens for outrage. They are invitations to remember and to question. Archaeology and text together can reclaim fragments, but they cannot undo the cost. The better we understand how systems made suffering routine, the more precisely we can detect similar patterns today when bureaucracy and spectacle collaborate to anonymize harm. 93 names on a wall in room 17, carved in darkness by people who refuse to be forgotten. Their names are restricted, classified, hidden in archives you and I will never access. But they existed. They carved proof into stone, and 2,000 years later, we found it. If you made it this far, you've just learned something the Roman Empire spent centuries trying to erase. Subscribe right now. Turn on notifications, because content like this doesn't get recommended. It gets buried. Hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube that history matters, that 93 names on a wall matter. And leave one word in the comments: remember, because that's what we do here. We remember the ones they tried to forget. The next video goes deeper, into the private homes where captives disappeared after the law passed, into the households that continued the exploitation in silence. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember Sabina. Remember room 17. Remember the wall. They carved their names so we would know they existed. The least we can do is speak them.